I'd like to open our proceedings this afternoon and invite you back again as a member of the committee, indeed, Minister. But can I just say, at the start of this session this afternoon, I think we would have, we appreciate your coming on so many different return visits and, very happy for you to come on every single occasion. We hope very much, given the fact that the Secretary of State isn't able to be with us for this, that obviously you'll be reporting back to her in full in terms of the concerns we have about this vital cross-cutting agenda. But anyway, it's good to welcome you in her stead, and also your two officials who've come along with you this afternoon. So what we're doing is we're looking to provide a progress report. Some people would call it a legacy report. We call it a progress report for the next Parliament and for our successor committee to make sure that the importance of cross-cutting environmental issues are flagged up, if you like, for when the next Parliament sits. And we're really returning to some of the themes that we've looked at over the course of this Parliament. And I want to start, if I may, just by asking you a little bit about the circular economy, because you'll be aware that we took evidence from your colleague at BIS just, I think, 2 weeks ago, although time flies. And one of the things that we were really concerned about was the Green Economy Council and the various industrial strategies, and that linked to the review that we did of BIS itself. And I think we were quite critical of the lack of cross-cutting issues from within BIS and relating to the industrial sectors and strategies as well. So can I just ask, by asking what discussions you've had with the Green Economy Council about getting the circular economy embedded into those industrial strategies, and what progress you think has been made?
Well, I think progress is being made on that basis, as you quite rightly set out. I should start off by responding to your earlier remarks. It's a pleasure to be here as a member of the committee in perhaps a slightly different capacity to the other members of the committee. I'm pleased that my attendance record has been fairly high recently.
Actually, if your attendance record was for all our meetings, we would be on much higher in the league in terms of the liaison committee.
On that subject of the Green Economy Council, I think it's a good piece of work to raise these issues across a range of sectors and to embed the idea of sustainable development and questions of sustainability in a wider context than just economic growth or the economic growth aspects of it. So for the various sector industrial councils now to have members who focus on that, working with their colleagues, I think is a really good development and a good step in the right direction. I'm sure you would press me to go further on that. You quite rightly said this is a report on progress, not legacy, because this work is continuing and will have to continue because there's so many big questions that you've tackled in your reports and that we're tackling as a government and as a department, that work continues. So what we look to now is as to how those sector-based councils mainstream, to use the word we've used a lot in our previous discussions, that work around sustainability and the work that they do.
Okay. But I think we did have the sense that the Green Economy Council hadn't really met most recently, and I just wondered, is there a sense of you actually pressing it and pushing it forward? I just get the sense that it's been acting a little bit in isolation and it hasn't really been embedded across government departments, and it has perhaps not been as active in the latter months as it was at the beginning.
I think the idea behind it, with the three secretaries of state who were involved in getting it established, was to begin that process, was to start that work and create a debate. What's happened now is it's moved into those the work that the industrial councils are doing on particular areas of business, which have been priorities, and you've already spoken to Mr Hancock about business approach and the support that they're giving there, we're very keen to see that question of sustainable development.
Sure, but can you just not see my concerns, given that there's been a change of Secretary of State from when it was actually proceeding, and just really to know what leadership or what momentum the current Secretary of State was really having to make sure that it didn't just lose its focus and didn't just lose its direction. I mean, it hasn't met recently, has it?
It hasn't met recently, you're quite right.
No, so when was the last time it met? So I didn't quite get that clear from your colleague at BIS.
January 2013 was the last time it met.
January 2013? Right. I think that speaks volumes. Because we're now 2015. Has that been a matter of concern to you?
As I say, I think what the process has moved on from the the council's beginning this work, starting it, and then mainstreaming into the work that's going on around those sectors.
But how can you keep tabs of it? How can you be sure that the vision that was there to actually embed sustainable environmental issues in terms of biz industrial strategies, and we're coming back to the circular economy, which is really critical, because it links in really to what my next question is going to be, because when we were doing our report on the circular economy, we were expecting that developments within the European Union would be a very strong, robust circular economy programme of work going forward. And then we were in a situation where we learned that it's going to be dropped, or we're not quite sure what its status is. And it just strikes me that if we haven't got a robust way of going forward within our own domestic parliament, or from within our own government, with leadership there, that really seems to reflect attempts inside Europe for what was going forward in Europe to be watered down. I mean, what was the line that the UK government took there? If it hadn't got the experience of the Green Economy Council to propel it forward.
Well, obviously there's two issues which are linked. I can understand the link that you're making there, but I'm quite happy to deal with those two things. First of all, our initial response to discussion around what the new Commission's proposal or approach would be to this.
Sure, but based on the experience domestically.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've said, the work that we've set out there is probably something which has not happened in a number of other jurisdictions in the European Union, and now it is about giving those industry councils the opportunity to react to that, to react to the report and the agenda that's been set for them, and then to check it. Now, it's not saying that the Green Economy Council doesn't exist, that it's been wound up, but we're allowing those industrial councils or those groups to do their work and to begin to make a difference on that.
You see, I can't help thinking that in terms of the industrial sectors who are going to be vital in terms of having their own strategies for their own industry going forward, if there's a perception that there isn't that leadership from the top, that it's something that isn't really being given all that much importance from government.
Well, as I said, I hope they wouldn't feel that, because this is a process that's begun under this government, and I think it was a good approach. I think if you look at my colleague Ed Davies, Secretary of State at DEC, leading the Green Growth Group at the European level as well, he's actually reached out to other governments and got them to focus on what can be delivered through green growth, and those meetings at the European level I think are very helpful too. So I think we have been at the heart of...
On that point, Caroline.
The lack of a meeting since January 2013, 2 years, doesn't that diminish the influence of DEFRA across government, in that the concept behind the Green Economy Council was for 3 Secretaries of State to interface with huge range of businesses across the economy showing interest in green growth? And what has DEFRA done to make sure that its influence remains as strong across the other 2 departments that are natural allies, BIS and DEC?
Well, there are a number of areas where we're making progress. So, for example, the bioeconomy, where, again, Matt Hancock has been, from his role as the Minister, to lead on that. DEFRA and BIS work very closely on the potential there is there.
I've just listened to Caroline Spellman's question, and I think I really would like an answer to her question rather than what we are doing.
Well, I think I took the question to be, has DEFRA given up on engaging with the departments on these issues, or are we still engaging with them?
I asked what DEFRA had done to put in place the opportunity to have influence across government, and specifically with those 2 departments, BIS and DEC, given that the Green Economy Council hasn't met for 2 years.
Well, we work with them very closely on a number of issues. We were talking last time I was in front of you about the opportunities on the connections between adaptation and mitigation in what we deliver in the policy context, but also in communications and how we keep that in the public eye and encourage other people to take account of adaptation, which is our remit, and using the opportunities that there are with DEC to highlight that. And we obviously have an important opportunity coming up with Paris to do some of that work when media attention is on it. I was mentioning in a relationship with BIS there the work that we're taking forward on the potential for work with resources that previously would have been waste, that we can actually use to exploit. I think that's an exciting area of work. And in terms of sustainable development more broadly, of course, at the official level as well, it's a responsibility of ours to make sure that other departments understand what we're trying to achieve and work with them. I don't know if, Colin, if you want to say a little bit about the work that's gone on there.
Yeah, so we've done a number of things to help get, as the Minister says, departments to understand what they need to do. We've done some work to assess how well that's going. So there's the work that's been done around business plans across government to ensure that they're taking account of sustainable development, and that's something that the Minister for Government Policy has taken a close personal interest in, as well as ministers in DEFRA. There's work that we've done to look at how effective the existing impact assessment system has been at picking up sustainable development issues and what we need to improve in that space. We've, for example, and this may sound small beer, but it's one of those things that I think does add up over time, put in place a learning opportunity on the Civil Service Learning Portal for officials to look at what does sustainable development mean for them, how do they need to think about it. So a whole range of different activities, the improvements to sustainability reporting in annual reports and accounts, working with Treasury as the lead on that, and so on. So a whole range of things on sustainable development. And a number of other issues. So, for example, I chair a group which is internal to government with one or two external people, the LGA and RAP, which brings together DEC, BIS, ourselves, Treasury, HMRC, DCLG, because we all have interest in the circular economy, and it's a place that we talk about some of the issues that we need to address and how we're going to address them. So at official level, there are, I would say, excellent working relations between those departments.
So that's at official level. How do you think the industrial members of the Green Economy Council construe the failure of the Green Economy Council to meet for 2 years? What do they read into that?
And have you had any representations from them about the fact that...
No,
not from any members of the...
No, and I suppose it would be a question you'd have to ask that would be unfair of me to ascribe views to them. Although, one would hope that if they were feeling that the work that they've undertaken is not being valued or is not being taken forward, that they would raise that. Certainly in other areas of policy, that's the approach that other sectors take if they feel that ministers have moved on from a subject or are not continuing to deliver on it.
Okay, I must move on. Can I just ask you very quickly then, when it was known that the European Union had dropped the proposed directive on the circular economy, what was your response to that?
Well, I was at the Environment Council following that, and a number of member states, sadly without contacting me or talking to me, because I would be interested to hear what they'd say prior to that meeting, had written to Commissioner Vella, I think at the time, to urge the new Commission not to drop that. The response I took there, both in meetings of the Council but also informally in discussions with Commissioner Vella and other colleagues across Europe, was to say, I think this is an opportunity for us to look at how we could go further. There have been concerns in some member states that some of the targets might not be practicable and deliverable for them, given the different rates of recycling, for example, there are across the European Union. But I do think it's an opportunity for us also to look at other aspects of the circular economy in terms of waste minimisation and remanufacture, which is something which is moving up the agenda as well. So while I understand the frustration amongst some, and certainly my discussions with the sector, the feeling that does this mean we're not going to get anywhere, my devout wish, and we have another meeting next week with the Council, so there'll be opportunity to talk to colleagues there, is that we come back to the issue that the Commission does take this work forward, but we can now add in the bits that perhaps we're missing.
Okay. And was it the UK's position, were you actually fighting for the package to be dropped in the programme in that form?
No, not at all. Although I think, with the new Commission coming in, I assume, I'm saying I wouldn't ascribe motives to people, I'm about to do it, but I think there was a willingness to sort of set the agenda and say, right, we're not just going to continue with the work that the previous Commission was doing, we want to look at this and decide whether this is where we want to be. But all the discussions that I've had, and I think the official level we've heard, is that we will return to this, and hopefully with a package which will be ambitious as well, because we want to see that level of ambition in there.
Okay, and just talking about that ambitious package, just looking at this, the sort of interregnum that there now is between now and when the next European directive is going to come forward, or next working programme is going to come forward. Given that Wales and Scotland have got recycling targets of 70% by 2025, do you envisage England following suit in terms of that?
Well, it's not been the policy of the coalition government to do that. In terms of what we'll have to see, as you say, what comes forward from the European Union, and then the next government will take a decision as to what the best way to respond to that is.
Okay, and can I just go back to our previous report where we had a recommendation which we thought was important, that the government should be looking at fiscal incentives in order to promote the circular economy? I
know in particular VAT was a question you raised, and obviously as is the refrain of any...
And subsidies and taxes as well.
That would be a matter for the Treasury. So I can't make answers on behalf of the Treasury here, but we think that there are other tools which are in place, obviously land.
So which are those tools?
Well, landfill taxes has continued to be a really powerful driver to stop material going into landfill, and we have seen across a number of sectors recycling and the reuse of materials going up.
Because it just seems very difficult to see what the incentives or what the levers are going to be to get us to where we need to be in terms of the targets that we should be having that we don't have.
Obviously, with different sectors, so for example, the quartile commitment has also driven a great deal of good work there. So we are improving, but I accept that there is the potential to look for other tools in the future. We're talking about what this government has done in its period in office, and I think there are areas of work around which I'm delighted to see the RAP's taken forward on food and on hospitality and so on, which I think are in the right direction. And so some of the question about what might be the right response to whatever targets we agree at the European level will have to flow from that, I think.
Okay, on that point, both Saka and Caroline want to come in.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, you rightly say that it's the Treasury that would need to decide in relation to any kind of fiscal incentives, but the Treasury would not be the organisation that would originate those ideas. That would more likely be DEFRA. So I think the question still stands. From your point of view and from the point of view of DEFRA, have you explored the possibility of using fiscal incentives to try and move us towards a circular economy? And have you had those discussions with the Treasury? I mean, they're clearly not going to have those discussions with you unprompted.
I think we will, when we know, when we have a sort of feeling of where we want to go next in terms of the levels we're seeking to achieve based upon what's agreed at the European level, that will be the point where, if we feel that the voluntary approaches and the existing trends are not going to get us there, then of course we have, any future government would have to look at that. But that's not a discussion that I've had with the Treasury. Of course, the work of this report is available to the Treasury just as it is available to DEFRA, and if the Treasury feels that this is an area that will be good for the economy and delivering on that sustainability we want to see, then of course they can respond in just the same way that I can.
But how will you know whether or not it is or isn't working?
How will you know?
How will you know? You say if it is the case that the voluntary approach isn't working, how will you know? What have you got in place to make the assessment that that isn't working?
Well, there's a number of waste and resource streams we could be talking about here, whether we're looking at municipal waste or whether we're talking about commercial, industrial or construction, and in various of those sectors things have moved on a long way. I don't know if you want to point to some of the work there.
Yeah, so in terms of things that RAP is leading for us in the voluntary action, one of the things it always tries to do is to put in place a baseline measurement to start off with the signatories, and then measures and announces publicly the progress in doing that. And so we've got reasonably good evidence around the reductions in food waste, the reductions in packaging use that have come out of the retail sector through the quartile commitments, for example. The Minister mentioned the hospitality and food service sector agreement, and we're taking a broadly similar approach there. We've also got work on clothing and on electricals, which again, we're looking to baseline first of all, and then collect the data on progress and make that data publicly available. And there are other examples.
Okay.
The new Commission used the criteria of jobs and growth being key when they came in. Were you surprised that Commissioner Timmermans put the circular economy package onto the list of regulation for reform or repeal, given the Chartered Institute of Waste Management's assessment that it would increase significantly in the UK, and make a significant contribution to GDP and create up to 20,000 jobs? Have you made an appointment to see Commissioner Timmermans to point this out?
Well, my understanding is that work is going on to a new package that can take account of this, and as I mentioned earlier, there are other aspects.
But don't you want to influence that?
No, absolutely, yeah, we have, and officials are involved in that. I've discussed this with Commissioner Vella, for example, and we're looking to get him to come over and to visit, and there are opportunities to engage members of the Commission to make the case for what can be delivered in terms of green growth. We have recently published our own growth prospectus, which has been well received by the sector and others, setting out what we think is the potential for a great deal of economic growth in this area that would also be sustainable, and that would also allow us to use expertise in this country to look at markets elsewhere as well. So I think that's a positive contribution that we're making to that work to make the case for the circular economy.
Thank you. I'll turn to Zach Goldsmith.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about natural capital. And given the emphasis that you and previous and other ministers, including Oliver Letwin, have put on the importance of natural capital over the years where we've been taking evidence, I'm interested in knowing why the Natural Capital Committee hasn't been given any kind of proper statutory footing by government. Can you explain why that is?
Well, first of all, we've continued its remit into the next Parliament, so the next government can take a decision as to how it responds.
I mean, if you look at the budget and so on, it doesn't stop the government making decisions, 2 or 3 years down the line. Why not in this case?
Well, we've extended it into the term of the next government, and then it'll be up to that future government to respond to that. I think the position of the government has been to do something which hadn't been done before, as you rightly say. This is groundbreaking work, so we're very pleased that it's been so well received. And a future government will then have to take the decision on.
But I'm interested in why, by kicking it beyond the election, that's pretty close to being an active decision to not give it a statutory footing. Obviously, no one knows what's going to happen at the election or who's going to be in charge. And I'm interested, just given it's hard to reconcile that decision with the emphasis that we have heard over and over again from right from the beginning of this parliamentary term on natural capital. So. Is there a reason why you think it should not have been put onto a statutory footing?
I have never said that I don't think it should ever be put on a statutory footing, and Mr. Goswell will have the chance to look at what the party's manifestos are in the run-up to the election as to what might happen in the
future. I'm talking about you in a plural sense. You, the government, have decided not to do
I think
this.
as the government, we want to get it established, to get it functioning, to establish the principle of accounting for natural capital, to change the ways in which the Treasury Green Book looks at some issues.
So can I move on? Without a Natural Capital Committee, which theoretically is possible pretty soon, who do you think would have the responsibility? Who should have the responsibility of advising government departments on the sustainable use of resources? And who would occupy that role?
Well, I mean, there is a National Capital Committee, and we've given it funding to continue into the next parliamentary term. So,
okay. But in the absence of it's got a very short-term contract. So, in the absence, and given the decision that the government's taken to not give it a long-term contract, it means it will end unless the next government, whoever it is, decides to pick up the ball and run with it. So, in the absence of the Natural Capital Committee, who do you think would do that job?
Well, as I say, it's not for me to speculate as to what a future government may or may not do with that. What I'm saying is that we have extended its remit, and I welcome that, and it will be a matter for that future government as to what they do.
I'm just trying to understand, why would the government leave it open, having done so much work on this? And as you say, it is pioneering work. Actually, my colleague here, Caroline Swan, was very much involved in this and responsible for it. Really pioneering work. But the government has left the door open now to effectively trashing that work in just a few months' time. If you lose the Natural Capital Committee, a very great deal of the work that's been done will have been for nothing. So I'm interested in why you've allowed that possibility and how to reconcile that with the commitment that we've seen right up to now to this concept of natural capital.
Well, anything this government done is not binding on future governments.
No, of course.
So I mean, in a sense, it's we talk about circular economy, it's a circular conversation.
Okay.
What are you doing to bind a future government? Well, we can't, other than obviously passing an act to Parliament, but then that can be repealed as well. So what we can do, and what we have done, is, as you rightly say, and you're quite right to pay tribute, and I should have done earlier and didn't, to Clarence Bum's time as Secretary of State, to establishing this body and welcome the work that it's done, and then we can make sure that it's not now, there's no interim, it's not disappearing in the meantime, and then it will be up to future government to decide how they take that work forward.
Thank you. So the committee produced its third report last month. It'd just be useful to know how the imminence of the general election might have impacted the government's consideration of that committee. I mean, has it been properly considered, do you think, or is it getting lost slightly in the chaos of a general election?
Well, it is being considered. I mean, it's not something that I hope you wouldn't expect us to consider something, overnight and not to reflect on it. So it is being considered now, and it feeds in, and that work can continue, beyond the general election. So for any future government will have the benefit of being able to respond to that and hopefully to take that work forward.
Okay, the second report outlines 7 types of natural assets which are at high risk, and I'm going to list them here: the clean water, wildlife, carbon storage, hazard protection, recreation, clean air and marine fisheries. The recommendations were made about a year ago. It would be interesting to know how those recommendations have influenced government decisions since then, or what the government has done in response to those recommendations. So if you could give us examples of any decision that has been in any way coloured by the existence of that.
I mean, one example would be, as you know, obviously moving towards the implementation of the new round of the common the new round of common agricultural policy will be beginning in summer. So to make sure the work on the catchment-based approach and clean water continues, we're making provision for that work to carry on up until the new scheme begins. Because and I was the other day speaking at a gathering of all the people involved in that work, right down at the local level, all the agencies, the Rivers Trust and so on, and hearing some fantastic examples of the work that they're doing. So, making a commitment to wanting to see that work continue would be an example of that on water, which is one of the things you just outlined. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I think there are things that we've been taking forward. In a sense, we've not waited for the final report. We've both looked at the interim reports and had continued discussion with the committee, and so there are various things that we're doing already to embed their work. For example, what we've done with the Treasury about the approach to investment appraisal, which then becomes part of the infrastructure of how government takes decisions. For the long term and right across the piece, and I think sort of quite a lot of policies, like the policy on the approach to planting more trees, creating more woodland, is very much in line with the committee's assessment of the importance of those for as a source of natural capital and a source of growth and well-being.
Okay. And those weren't commitments that were made irrespective of the Natural Capital Committee recommendations?
Well, I think they're things that are entirely consistent with it.
No, consistent with it, but things that have happened as a consequence of the committee's recommendations, or decisions that have been altered as a consequence. I mean, the purpose of the committee is not just to talk about things like individual conservation projects. It's about creating a lens through which all decisions are taken in an interest of maintaining our natural capital as a nation. It would just be interesting to know, practically speaking, how you think that's happened. And I accept that this is a very, very complicated process, and I'm not suggesting this is something that can happen overnight as a consequence of one policy, but it would be useful to know practically how this has impacted on government decisions.
I mean, another piece of work that has flowed from this has been the work that the Office of National Statistics has been doing in cooperation with DEFRA to look at actually how would we value natural capital and include that in the framework of national accounts. And they published some pilot accounts a few months ago which have covered some sectors. They're continuing with that work. Indeed, I think there's an meeting of the steering group today to look at the next set of pilot accounts.
Okay, thank you. Now, I've got actually two more questions. One very quick one is that in the same report, the second report, so a year ago, the committee recommended that we should have a 25-year natural capital plan. I don't believe the government has committed either way. It hasn't rejected the idea and it hasn't confirmed that it agrees that there should be a 25-year plan. Can you tell us now what the view of the government is? Should there be a 25-year plan?
Well, I'm not going to sort of announce government policy here, as you say. That's I think that's a. I can understand the view of the committee there in the long term. We need to set those things out. That's not something, as you say, the government has responded to. So I'm not in any position to move.
But will the government respond to it before the election? Do you think? I mean, it's been a year.
Yeah. I mean, that's a matter for the government as a whole, not for me. I'm the minister sat here, so I'll have to take it.
But who, out of interest, I mean, I've never been a minister, so it's hard to know, but who would make that decision? Or who would make the pitch to the person who has to make the decision? How would that process work? Presumably you would have a role in that.
Potentially, or the Secretary of State.
So you would pitch that to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State would respond, or they'd have to pitch it to the Treasury?
Well, or would you drive it? Or, I mean, how would it emerge? Where would it come from?
Exactly the point I'm trying to make very clumsily is that these things don't just happen. Someone has to be pushing them. And I'm interested to know in the government who... And you seem to be sympathetic with the idea that there should be a long-term natural capital plan. So I'm interested in knowing what you have done with that proposal. Has it been pitched to the Secretary of State? Is this something that's being discussed, or is it now floating around the ether?
Well, it's not floating around the ether. I mean, it's in terms of the issues that I've been taking forward in the 18 months I've been in the job. There are the work on natural capital is something that's been happening across government, and we've received the reports, as you said. It's not been an issue that I've been able to sort of take to a cabinet committee and say, we need to reach a decision on this right now. I mean, I think that setting out that long-term vision, I can understand the approach. I think is a good challenge to government to do, but it's something that does have to be considered right the way across government as how we respond to that challenge. And I suspect in the final weeks of this government that we're not going to see any big change. But in terms of the most recent report that's just been published, obviously there are questions there for us to deal with, and the analysis and the response to that is something that officials are considering, ministers will consider in due course.
So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to, in a mercenary fashion, wedge in a question about Kew Gardens, which is relevant to natural capital. Yeah. And I'm just interested, we had a very good debate, which you responded to in Westminster Hall on the issue, and there was a really strong consensus around the need to provide long-term certainty for Kew Gardens, not these sporadic panic cheques being written by government on the back of protests, which is what we've seen in the last year. And one of the things you said you would do is take the idea to DFID that they should shoulder some of the responsibility, some of the funding responsibility for the work conducted at Kew that's relevant to global, international poverty alleviation programs and so on. I'm just wondering whether you had that discussion with DFID, and if you did, what was their response?
Well, as you'll be aware, I was responding to that debate as the responsible minister.
The acoustics are really bad, especially for Hansard.
But I think it's for me in particular. I'm clearly a bit of a mumbler when I'm in front of the committee. The ministerial responsibility for Kew Gardens, as you're aware, lies with my colleague Lord de Morley.
But he's part of your department.
Absolutely. So I fed.
So definitely, you're here representing the Secretary of State.
So I fed back the discussion that we had there. But then obviously that's a question.
Can I ask if you specifically asked him to raise this with DFID, or did he just hand in the transcript of the debate? I mean, was this point highlighted specifically? It was a long debate.
It was.
That specific point, which attracted full consensus.
I had discussions with officials immediately after the debate about that. And then they take that back to
Sure, but if it had been me in your shoes, I would have absolutely followed it up and pursued it so we knew exactly what DFID was going to do about it, because Kew Gardens is in a state of crisis.
Well,
it's not just a fact of it being a constituency matter. We have to find a way through this.
Well, the direct question we've got is, have I had that discussion? And it's not for me to have that discussion, it's for my ministerial colleague to do that. But I know that he values very highly the work that goes on, and that he's been very closely involved in the discussions about its future and about how we get it to continue to make that huge contribution it does to science and also the public benefit that there is.
Do you know if he had that discussion, or if
I'd have to write to the committee and check whether he's done it.
Okay. I mean, I have to say on this issue, and it is a constituency issue, but it is also a national issue. It would be really good to see a sign of proactivity as opposed to the kind of passivity that we're seeing in relation to Kew Gardens. And if your department could get back to me or the committee and let us know how those discussions with DFID have panned out, I would really appreciate that, and I know my constituents would, and all the many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of supporters of Kew would.
Well, I mean, I think I have to say that in terms of the approach the government's taken, you described it in terms of injections of money over and above what was agreed, coming as sort of a quick reaction. I think actually it's part of giving Kew Gardens the management of it, the ability to move from where they are now to where we hope it will be in the future, and that money will help them to do that. And I also know Lord Morley has taken a very close interest in this personally, so I'm sure he has considered all the options there are. But on that specific point,
the committee would be very grateful to have a response on it. Thank you. Just two very quick questions from me as well, while we're still on natural ecosystem services. Ancient woodland. Some of us were at a meeting earlier today looking at the importance of ancient woodland, protection of ancient woodland, concerns about there not being protection in the infrastructure bill or the infrastructure legislation. Do you have a view on that?
Do I have a view on whether we should protect ancient woodland? Well, I think ancient woodland is obviously one of our crucially important types of ecosystem we have in this country, and that's why planning guidance is very, very clear about how that should be treated and how that should be protected and valued. I had a meeting the other day on another subject with the Woodland Trust. I'm very much aware of the excellent work that they do to keep the importance of ancient woodland in the public consciousness and in the political consciousness as well. And I welcome that. In terms of the debate around the infrastructure bill, it was very clear, and we'll be talking about public forest estates as well as part of those discussions, that there was no sort of change about how forests or woodlands would be dealt with under the infrastructure bill.
Sure.
But people required something on the face of it about public forest estate, which we're happy to do.
But isn't the key point in all of this, and it came out actually during the legislative stages of the infrastructure bill, that we were given assurances that during its passage in the Lords, there would be a question of how ancient woodland could be preserved, but this didn't seem to have been acted upon before it then came back. So we're in this situation where we've got different departments. It was your colleague from a different department who was leading on that bill, but it comes back to the point that Right Honourable Caroline Spellman was making about how this cross-cutting agenda across different departments all comes together, and we need to have that leadership role really taken from within DEFRA.
Yeah, well, you're quite right that forestry and woodland policy is a DEFRA lead. The infrastructure bill in particular was a very, very complex piece of legislation that touched a number of departments, but I think will make a big difference to delivering the infrastructure that we want to see to underpin that growth. The protection of ancient woodlands which are there, I think have done a good job in protecting them, and we've not seen a sort of huge degradation at all of that environment. But however, we do need to keep these things under review, and we need to make sure that were there to be any particular threat, that that would have to be taken on board. But I've not, I think that the rate of decline of ancient woodland, which might have been accelerated in the past, is
given that the concern is that the rate of decline will be accelerated by both the infrastructure bill and the means of approving the HS2 line, I put it to you that should be something that should be looked at with some urgency in terms of looking at better safeguards. And I think we'd just like to know whether or not that is something that you are proactively taking forward from within DEFRA across other departments.
Well, I mean, HS2 is a huge project which touches on the work of a number of departments, and certainly, our concern about the ecological impact is something that feeds into that. And I suppose if there's any work that our officials are doing as the passage of the bill through.
Well, I mean, we do have quite close links with colleagues elsewhere who are working on HS2, and we've had quite a lot of discussions about their approach to looking at...
So how are you holding them to task?
Well, they have been talking to us about what approach they want to use to monitor their own impact, you know, they are very keen to be able not only not to have negative impacts, but to be able to demonstrate clearly that that is the case.
So I think what we're seeing is that those managing the project are well aware of the importance of ancient woodland, both locally and nationally. You know, it's something which people value very highly.
Okay, if my colleagues will allow me, I'd just like one very quick question as well, in respect of marine conservation zones, in respect of overseas territories and biodiversity. Are we likely to have an announcement on that? Is DEFRA pushing for designation of marine protection in overseas territories, including Pitcairn?
I think there's a very strong case being made for how important those environments are.
Are you making that case?
Well, we're having a discussion. I think the committee is clearly very ambitious for the last few weeks of this government that we would see a lot of
okay, so we'll watch that space.
I think the likelihood of something being announced in the last few weeks of this government is...
okay, thank you very much. I'll turn to my colleague, Neil Carmichael.
Thank you. I would like to talk about air quality, and in particular the fact that this committee produced a report back in 2011, and we were looking at wanting to see a national framework for low emissions zones, and we think that that's something we would like to hear more about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the fact that this work has been driven locally has not prevented low emission zones from coming in. So good work has been done in places like Oxford and Norwich, and now
and London.
The provision being made for an ultra low emission zone, which the Mayor wants to see in London. So that work is taking place. However, I think the committee made some very good points, and in discussions with Mr. Hayes, who was here as well, we were talking about ways that we could help take that agenda forward. So the department is now looking at ways that we could make it easier for local authorities to respond to this. If we can have some common tools, then we think that could potentially make it easier for local authorities to take advantage of the opportunities that are already there. So the opportunities are there, but if we make it easier for them, then we think that would be helpful. So there's work going on that.
Picking up Caroline's point before about the influence that DEFRA has, is this perhaps an example where DEFRA could have been pushing a bit harder on the subject of air quality and emissions, given that you've just mentioned John Hayes' role as Minister of State Transport?
Well, we have been pushing very hard on the discussions that our colleagues at the Department for Transport are leading on emission standards for vehicles at the European level, and in fact, it's been an easy collaborative relationship because they agree, DFT agree that they want to see real world performance of those standards, which perhaps hasn't been delivered with previous standards. So I think that's something we work together very closely on. With regard to the role of DEFRA and what we can do to help them, we provide sums of money but also expertise and support to local authorities to consider options at the local level. So the approach has been during the period of the coalition government not to mandate local authorities to do that, but to help give them the tools they need in order to deliver the options which work for them locally.
That's a bit different though, isn't it, to our aspiration for a national framework?
Yeah.
So when do you think we'll get a national framework?
Well, I mean, that's the approach you take. Do you dictate it from the centre as to what that approach should be, or do you encourage local authorities to recognise the importance of air quality and to work on that? I think I mentioned it when I came to appear before you as a part of that inquiry. I've been involved with talking to a range of stakeholders about the importance in local areas and how we make the case locally for making this a priority. And we're now saying that there is work we think we can do centrally to make it easier for them to bring in those tools locally. So
I was going to say, we have an air quality grant fund that we deploy from DEFRA, and we funded something around 20 separate studies and feasibility projects in local authorities looking at LEZs to help themselves in a position they can then take a political decision locally as to whether or not they want to do it. One other thing I was going to add that might be useful to bring to the committee's attention.
Acoustics difficult.
Beg your pardon. One other thing I was going to add that the committee might find useful in terms of emphasis on tackling air quality, of course, is the fact that within the investment programme on roads recently announced, there was a separately identified stream of funding to go above and beyond the business as usual in terms of tackling air quality, and £100 million initially assigned to that. And that's a very significant investment in finding ways to address air quality in a number of road infrastructure projects.
Neil, may I just come in on that? Because one of the recommendations of our report, which was something which we actually took up when the infrastructure bill was going through, was to have a duty in respect to the new formed successor highways agency to actually embed issues of sustainability into that, which would have related, of course, to new road building. That wasn't something that the government, despite offering to look into it, actually took up. I mean, that would have been a much more proactive way of dealing with this rather than a very, in relative terms, amount of money to actually put up a fund to deal with some of this.
My understanding is that the licence for Highways England will include that kind of requirement on it to consider environmental and other sustainable development.
But not a duty?
In its licence. So its licence to operate says you must think about these things.
The absence of a national framework, I suppose, has a number of implications. One is the one you've really just touched upon. If you're just thinking about transport and roads, the other problem is, of course, there are other sources of threats to air quality, which a national framework might want to, and should in fact, consider. But putting that aside for one moment, one of the other things this committee has been thinking about is the lack of clarity over the boundaries of responsibility between central and local government over air quality. Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, we've done some work to help to clarify those responsibilities. As you're aware, we've been talking about the reporting requirements on local authorities, and we think it's right to adopt a partnership approach because some of these issues need to be settled at the European level, not just in terms of regulation, but also in terms of the sources of some of the air quality issues that we have at different times, depending on which way the wind is blowing. There are national questions for us to deal with, and there are also some very local issues because, as with all of these, one of the drivers in public health terms and local environmental quality, those effects are being felt locally where those emissions are taking place. So there are clear drivers for those in local government, as there are those of us in politics nationally, to address the concerns that people have in their communities about air quality. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the sort of stakeholder forum where I was talking to local authorities there, it's interesting how they were now the public health function is more allied within local government, looking at ways they can make that case locally to make it a priority politically, but also amongst the community, because it's also about behaviour changes and sustainable transport and all those sorts of solutions, and winning public approval for those solutions. So it's a two-pronged thing. It's making the case of why this is something people need to worry about, and then looking at what those solutions might be locally. But as I have said, we are looking now at ways in which we can help local authorities to perhaps bring some of these solutions in more quickly and to standardise some of those approaches a little bit.
So that would be the sort of the essence of any future national framework you would come up with?
Or whether it's forming a national framework, I think it's a piece of work which will help local authorities to be able to react more quickly and to have the evidence at their disposal, but also a toolkit that they can use to do that. And in terms of the evidence, we have experts that report to us, and there's information that we make public about what the effects are, what the sources are of air pollution, and that's evidence which can also be used by local authorities in their work for modelling locally.
Can I move on to the question of diesel versus petrol? Because, of course, there's an advantage in having diesel, but Given the evidence about diesel's impact on air quality, what are your thoughts about the likely direction of travel in terms of taxation of diesel and encouragement of diesel?
Well, back to taxation questions again, to which I refer the Honourable Gentleman to the answer I gave a moment ago about the Treasury. Having said that, I think the biggest problem with what we've experienced is the way that diesel engines haven't actually delivered against the measures which they were assessed against. So in other words, in real world conditions, they've not performed as well as was hoped. So that's why it's important that at the European level, when we set these regulations that the manufacturers have to operate under, that we get that right and that those testing regimes are right. So that's the work that's going on now, so that future rounds will deliver more improvement. But also there are other opportunities. The government's put a huge amount of money into taking forward ultra-low emissions vehicles through subsidy for electrical vehicles, and working closely with the industry to get those jobs and that innovation based in this country as well. We've got some real good success stories with manufacturers manufacturing ultra-low emission vehicles here. So I think that there's a lot that we can do, and I think getting hung up on perhaps two particular fuels is not necessarily the right way forward. We need to look at the emissions of all vehicles, and there are a range of solutions out.
Have you had a word with the Society of Motor Manufacturers, for example, on those sort of subjects?
I think we've just had a letter that I think has gone to the Department for Transport from, certainly at least one of the manufacturers, if not a range of others. So we do get that input from them. And I would understand the consent of anyone in the industry that what happens is proportionate and actually based on evidence and delivers, and that's what we should seek to do. But I would hope that in working with the industry, we can come up with something which they can be proud of as well, that they're delivering improvements for the communities in which their vehicles are being used.
So in short, that's really a relationship with the Department of Transport and other actors in the field, so generally aim for technical changes. And
it is, and in terms of other things like energy generation, obviously that's the responsibility of the Department of Energy and Climate Change, but we still have a role in that and engage with them on that, so discussions about emissions from those sources.
Yeah.
On that point.
Could I just come in on this? We had some really interesting evidence when we were doing our TTIP inquiry that actually regulation in America of diesel engines is stricter than it is in Europe. Has DEFRA thought about the impact of the mutual recognition of regulations and the way in which the stricter regime on diesel vehicles in the United States might actually help us tackle some of our air quality challenges?
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, it's my understanding, and things may have changed, but certainly I remember looking at this a few years ago, and there were different rules in different states. So California, for example, had taken very tough lines. There were far fewer diesel vehicles in California than there are in perhaps some other states. So I think it's it's not just at the federal level discussing there, but I'm sure there are examples that we could look at in other in various states across the United States. But Europe itself is a big market, and if we can get these things right here, then in our discussions with other markets around the world, we can hopefully make progress, because we all know, of course, problems that are in developing countries or those countries which have rapidly developed. This is a big problem for them too.
And if you just allow one more thing, do you think with hindsight, this is a progress report, look back, look forward, do you think with hindsight we could have been spared the fines that are now being imposed on us for non-compliance with the Air Quality Directive if government across the board had embraced the idea of expanding the number of low emission zones?
Possibly, although if we were doing it on the basis of the vehicle standards, if the vehicle standards didn't deliver, it wouldn't have actually material. So I think that's the biggest problem for us, has been where vehicles have been the source of these particular problems, is that if you designed a low emission zone on the basis of a model that then didn't actually manifest itself in the real world, we wouldn't have been much further forward. So we do really have to improve that testing and make sure that therefore our modelling is more correct in the future.
Sorry.
Yeah, you go.
Okay.
One more question, though.
Yes, I know. It was just on that point, because you, in response to Caroline's question, you said it possibly, in terms of national emission zones, would be good to have that. But, in the government's response to our report, you've rejected that.
Well, what we've said is that we've accepted that there are things we can help to do to make it easier for local authorities to bring in.
But that's... making it easier as if they wish to on a voluntary capacity, perhaps having a template of best practice, but it's not the same as driving it and showing the European Union exactly how we're going to deal with all the breaches of their quality standards that we've got. Well, it just seems to me to be a contradictory set of responses that you're giving us. It
hasn't been. We were looking back across what this government's done, and it's not been the government's policy to sort of drive it top down. There are
sure, but we've had frustration in our reports that there hasn't been this policy. We came up with a recommendation which would have given an opportunity for a policy, which has been rejected by the government in its response to us. Yet, that could be taken forward now.
Well, I still think that the biggest change we can make is looking at what the source of these emissions are, which is the vehicles, and getting those right. So if we tackle that issue at the European level, that will make a big difference. And we can also, and I welcome what the Mayor of London is talking about. We can also get behind ultra-low emission vehicles, and we can support local authorities to bring these things forward. It's my understanding that perhaps in some of the jurisdictions where they have taken a more top-down approach, because of the same problems we're talking about, they haven't necessarily delivered what they hoped that they would deliver. And it perhaps I'm unfair at this point to start picking on other countries.
But the fact remains,
I don't think that would have been the answer that would have changed.
No, but the fact remains that the UK is in court over failure to comply.
Which other member states, the vast majority of other member states are in the same position.
Well, that doesn't make it right. No,
it doesn't make it right, but I'm just saying that the fundamental problem with that is not necessarily around a policy of setting what standards should be in every town centre, but it is about whether the major causes of those pollutions, which are the vehicle emissions, whether they are actually being dealt with.
But if the government has rejected, which it has, our recommendations for a national emission zone, how is it going to demonstrate that it is actually taking concerted action with determination to meet the air quality standards according to the directive, and we haven't got the plans in place for that?
Because a lot of these issues are European-wide issues, what we've said to the Commission is that we want to work with them on looking at the steps that need to be taken, because it will affect all the other jurisdictions as well. It's not something that in some areas of policy, if a country is subject to infraction proceedings, it's because everyone else is getting it right and you've just lagged behind and you're not doing it. And that's quite rightly what it's there to do. What we're in a position here is that this is a situation which is threatening, in terms of nitrogen dioxide emissions and so on, is threatening people across the European Union in terms of infraction. So we are the first in the queue there. And so what we said is we could work with the Commission to come up with the policies that will reassure them that we are doing our utmost to tackle this, including the negotiations at the European level to get this right.
Which I'll let Neil Carmichael return to.
Well, exactly. Do you think the exchange you just had with the chairman have something to do with the European Commission's reluctance to introduce new tighter targets and directives on this subject?
Well, this is another thing that we've been quite clear that we want the Commission to return to the issues of air quality, because as you rightly set out, that's another package that the Commissioner said the new Commissioner said that it wants to look at. So we've been very clear that we think this is an important piece of work and that we need to get it done as soon as possible, and to use that word, to be ambitious in what comes out the other end.
So how will you be articulating that ambition as the European Commission moves in that direction?
Well, opportunities at European Council, of which there are another both formally and informally at those gatherings, and then in the official level where officials have been engaged with the discussions about where we should go to make sure that what comes next does the job.
Will you be effectively talking about the importance of local authorities and so on, as opposed to a national framework, or will you be thinking about some other mechanism?
Well, there are a range of sources of the problems that we're talking about here. So I mentioned energy as another one. So it's not necessarily all about vehicles and what local authorities can do with low emission zones. I think my colleague was saying that there are other factors as well.
So some of the zones that are in breach for NO2, for example, are not in a town centre. So, or the bits that cause the zone to be in breach are not in a town centre. So you could have an LEZ in the nearest town centre and it would make no difference to that exceedance, because actually it's a motorway junction or a junction of several major roads that's causing the problem. So there you have to look at something else. So LEZs might well help in places like London for the reasons that the Mayor has set out, but they wouldn't help for all of these things. You know, in London, about 80% of nitrogen dioxide emissions comes from transport. In other places, there are other sources, as the Minister said. But for London, you need to influence what people drive, where they drive, and how they drive, in order to address that kind of thing. Some other places, it will be a different balance between those different things.
Is that the sort of evidence and realism that you refer to in response to our report on this subject when we say what would you want to do about the European Commission's plans?
So, in terms of how we have committed publicly to revise the air quality plans for the UK, to improve the speed at which we'll attain compliance. And that's a piece of work that's going on now, and we've said that we'll complete it by the end of this calendar year, and it will be publicly available, give it to the Commission, etc. Exactly what goes into that will be a decision for the next administration to take, and there'll be a lot of questions about exactly how we do that. But clearly, local authorities will have a big role, as will central government, as the Minister has said often, standards at a European level. You know, the cars that are on the road now will be on the road for several years more. We need to make sure the new cars coming on the road meet the standards, don't have the problems we've got at the moment. Otherwise, it will be even harder to meet those controls.
So, just one last question. In terms of what you would say is realistic, it would be effectively a recognition of the technology that we've got and how things are moving along in connection with any further targets that the European Commission might want to set.
You certainly have to look at what technology we've got, but also how things develop. I mean, if you stuck a finger in the air maybe 10 years ago about the future of vehicles, would you have gone for the kind of electric or plug-in hybrid that we're seeing on the roads now? You might have, but you might have gone for hydrogen fuel cell or whatever else. So you have to be careful you don't shut out the possibility of other technologies and other approaches. There's a limit to how much you can count on them miraculously appearing, so you have to get that balance.
Okay, thank you.
Let's move on. I'm with Alan Whitehead. Dr. Alan Whitehead.
When we did our environmental scorecard report last year, which I'm sure you've had a detailed look at, required reading, I imagine, across the department, we looked in that report at the review the government carried out of the balance of competences between EU and UK. And I think it's fair to say that report found that fairly few EU regulations were complained about. Did the environment chapter of the balance of competences review then produce anything useful in your view to DEFRA for policy making purposes?
One of the things it's allied to is the work we're doing again at the European level to work with colleagues in other countries to see how the responsibilities under the different directorates general can be brought together to make sure that those cross-cutting issues are dealt with at the European level, and also that they can be simplified, not in any way watered down, and we're working particularly with our Dutch colleagues on that. So that's an example of how our discussions here have helped how give us the evidence to bring to those discussions as well. So but I think it's a good process to go through to look at that, and I would, as you might expect, as a pro-European, I would say that in terms of the area of environmental policy, what's happened at the European Union over the last several decades has helped us to make a big difference about improving environmental quality right the way across the Union. So I think it's been a good thing. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that as legislation and regulation accumulates, you can't look at the balance of competencies, but also how those things work together to see if they are delivering the outcomes that you want to see, and if they couldn't be done in a more efficient way.
But I assume from that, in addition to your personal position vis-à-vis the EU, that your view, I would guess, of the balance of competencies report is that the relation of competencies in Europe, perhaps bringing in some caveats about the flexibility of EU policy between member states, would broadly be that there isn't a great deal that perhaps ought to come back to the UK from EU in principle.
We've just been talking about areas of policy that clearly have there's a big European dimension to them in terms of how the single market operates.
Yeah.
So that it makes sense to do that in terms of burdens that are. Burdens is a very pejorative term, but sort of regulation conditions that are placed on how markets operate for environmental and sustainability reasons. Obviously, if you're operating in a single market, you want to make sure that everybody is doing the same things, so that you're not disadvantaged by doing the right thing. I would also go further than that in many cases, and we were talking about the circular economy earlier on, that by doing the right thing, you can actually make yourself more efficient and more competitive. So. It works both ways. But I think we're always cautious whenever the Commission looks at updating its work on a certain area to examine that for where the current balance of competences is, and to ensure that we're not seeing issues which are currently debated at the national level sort of taken away. I think that's a good process to challenge as well, because I think our constituents and this Parliament would expect that process to go on. That's why we have the scrutiny that we do have. But in terms of many of the issues we're talking about on environmental policy, because they're cross-border, there is a logic, I think, to those things being considered collectively.
Is that, though, conversely, bearing in mind that the Commission is certainly appearing to focus on jobs in the economy during 2015, an issue of perhaps a slowing up of environmental issue progress over the present period, next 2 years? Have you observed that in terms of your discussions with your EU colleagues and in EU forums?
No, I haven't. First of all, other member states would agree with us that this remains an important area of work that we want to continue to move forward on. And then again, returning to our discussions about the circular economy, the idea that you can deliver green growth, I think is an important concept, because by being more efficient and using the resources we have more efficiently will allow us to be more competitive on the world, on the world stage as well. So, and we can be at the forefront of innovation. So, if you like, the pause that the new Commission has put in place on a couple of these areas of work allows us to update it even further and to make sure it's fit for purpose for where we are now, rather than where we were when that work began.
Well, have you picked up any concerns from other environmental ministers in Europe about the potential, bearing in mind where those competencies are in the EU, for a number of the frameworks to be changed as a result of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations presently going on?
That's not something that's been debated in detail when I've been there. I've been talking to other colleagues, so I know that there's a determination amongst those who are involved in these trade discussions to ensure that the high standards we have secured on environmental issues are not in any way watered down as a result of negotiations that are happening with our colleagues. And of course, as we've just heard, in fact, in some cases, despite what people might think, in areas in the United States, people have worked very hard to protect their own environmental quality and to take standards there. So there are real benefits, I think, for increasing understanding between us about what that experience is and how well that could work. The experience that I've had about the new Commission's position, there was that air of disquiet on the air quality and circular economy packages at that moment, but I think we've now moved beyond that on the basis that those areas of work are continuing and that new proposals will come forward, and I think that will reassure. But I will see a little bit more when I go to the Environment Council next week as to what people's feelings are when we have the opportunity for some sort of informal chats with colleagues in other governments.
So that would be a bottom line as far as you're concerned?
What would, sorry?
In terms of TTIP negotiations? Well,
the government's been very clear across all that we're doing that in any discussions around the environmental standards that we've put in place over many years, whether it's in terms of our own challenge to regulation and deregulatory agenda, we don't want to do that at the expense of watering down the gains that have been made on environmental quality, and similarly, therefore, in our discussions over TTIP, or the European Union's discussions over TTIP, our part of that as a member state, we would want to guard against that.
Yeah. I think you'll be aware that when we did the scorecard report, we singled out, of the 10 environmental areas we examined, we singled out 3 as coming up red, as it were. You did at the time reject the committee's recall for a strategy for the environment as such. Can you say, in terms of the areas that we examined as red, and that was air quality, biodiversity and flooding, what specific measures, in default of an overall strategy, that the Department has been able to deliver in those areas to reduce the redness, should we say?
Okay, if I take, we've discussed air quality and the view that we think that now that there is more we can do to make it easier for local authorities to take action locally. So that would be an example on that area. In terms of flooding, I think we've spent more in this Parliament than was spent in the last Parliament. I would pay tribute to the Environment Agency for the way in which they've used the resources which are given to them to restore flood defences so quickly after the extreme weather events of the winter of 2013 and 2014. And we've now set out in December that 6-year pipeline of flood defence schemes for the future, which will allow communities to work towards bringing those flood defences in, which make a really big difference to them. And I think that's so I'm very pleased that the government has been able to do that, to set out how we will invest that money in the future. So I think on flooding we are in we have a strong argument to say that the government has taken these issues very seriously, and we're working with local communities to come up with the solutions that really will make a difference locally. And your sorry, you have to remind me on the third biodiversity. Well, I happily have Shirley Jonathan next to me, who is the expert who can talk to you about, and in fact we gave evidence together during that scorecard inquiry, you probably remember, about how things have moved on but it's only been a few months since the scorecard report, but nonetheless we could talk about it.
I mean, I would reiterate, of course, that the government's strategic approach to all of this was set out in the Natural Environment White Paper in relation specifically to biodiversity. We've got the document Biodiversity 2020, which sets out the aims and objectives for improving habitats and species. So we are continuing the work, particularly crucially through the development of the new Countryside Stewardship Scheme, which will be our main mechanism for creating fresh habitats. I'm afraid I can't quite remember what point we were at when we last appeared in front of the committee, but we have been able to announce quite a lot more detail of the Countryside Stewardship Scheme over the last few months, setting out more detail, for example, about the inclusion of a pollinators and wildlife package, which should deliver benefits across a wide range of biodiversity. And this new scheme will be more targeted to make sure that we incentivise farmers to deliver the right things for the location and environment of their particular farm, and therefore we expect to deliver a good deal more bang for our bucks from the new scheme.
A final thought on the scorecard report is we did put forward a suggestion that there should be an independent body, an Office for Environmental Responsibility at the time of the report, which did not find favour with you or with the government. Would you say that rejection then encompasses perhaps a disagreement then with the Natural Capital Committee's recommendation that they had for assigning institutional responsibility for monitoring the state of natural capital? Is that something different, or would that be something that one would take that you would not find congenial either.
Well, I mean, the position of the government hasn't changed since our response to your, as you might have expected. However, just keen again to reiterate the fact that we have delivery bodies, Natural England, the EA, Forestry Commission, who can provide the government with expert advice on the environmental implications of policies and also on the state of the natural environment as other practitioners who are relevant. So we have that, we have the benefit of that. And so we just didn't accept that recommendation on that basis, and that hasn't changed.
Yeah.
I mean, the scorecard report was published, what, I don't know,
So
6 months ago? Sorry?
Yeah. So would the same go for the Natural Capital Committee's proposal? You think that would be a bad idea as well?
Well, I think we're here to talk about what the coalition government's view is and to look at what action we've taken. And I think the fact that, as I said earlier, we've had the National Capital Committee in operation, giving us that advice. We've now across government looking at the approach of taking account of that natural capital, what it means and how important it is to us. And I think that's something the government has achieved, and we've moved on a long way. And in terms of what comes next about that, what steps it would be appropriate to take next, and that would be a matter for a future government, and also, as I've said, for the parties and their respective manifestos to set out in the run of the election.
Right, okay, I'm going to try and do the impossible and change gear, because we've got quite a few things that we want to get through still in terms of heading. So I'm going to, including myself, ask all of us to be brief, including the responses as well. And I'll move on to
Shirley Trundle has very kindly really supplied the answers that I was going to ask about as a result of the pilots. What's the current state of play? But you've answered in relation to particularly agriculture. I suppose I'd just like to put to you one question on biodiversity offsetting, which is linked to our own inquiry on High Speed 2 and our concerns that the environmental assessments are flawed to some extent, and the opportunities exist to do ambitious biodiversity offsetting in relation to major infrastructure projects. Has the department given it, a sustainable land management scale, some thought as how to get best biodiversity offsetting from a project, if it happens, of the scale of High Speed 2?
Well, I think the position really is that we've had
Please speak up.
We've had the work done, we've had the pilots, and now we're looking at the evidence that can come from that as to what the best way forward on what the benefits or potential pitfalls of any new policy might be around offsetting. And we've all heard from, in fact, a range of sectors, the pros and cons from both sides. So if you look at the NGOs, for example, some see the possibilities here, others are very concerned about offsetting being seen as a way of sort of watering down the protections there are around planning. So I think it's a piece of work that we'll have to continue to work on, and we won't be able to conclude that by the end of this government's period of office.
Okay. And just for the record, so just so I'm absolutely clear, I mean, is it the case that the biodiversity offsetting is really being pushed into the long grass by the current Secretary of State?
Well, no. I mean, the pilots are concluded, and so we're now looking at the evidence that comes from those, and that work continues.
Okay.
That work continues.
Okay. Just a few quick questions in respect of pollinators and pesticides. And obviously we were very much in support of a ban of neonicotinoid pesticides. And I just wonder whether or not the government is still open to the possibility of challenging the EU ban on neonicotinoids. In terms of, what's the government's position on that?
Well, the Commission has said that they'll undertake a review, as I'm sure you're aware, by May, and they haven't yet set out how that review will be conducted. So it's likely to begin with a technical review of the scientific data by the European Food Safety Authority, and the results will then be considered by the Commission.
Okay, and in respect of the government getting involved in that review, is it going to be doing its own independent research, or is it going to be left to the pesticide industry to make the running on that?
Well, there are some opportunities for us to be involved in what the Commission does as well. So there'll be national experts included in that technical assessment that I was just describing, experts from our regulator, the Health and Safety Executive, can participate.
But the concerns remain, don't they, that research is not really being done objectively or independently?
We set out that research will be, I'm not the right terminology, but sort of scoped and overseen by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So there is an independent body involved in what that research looks like. I think the committee's concern, if I remember rightly, was about
so when
the
you
funding
say
of that.
When you say independent, can you just describe what you mean by that?
Well, that it's not the industry sort of
paying for it.
Something.
The industry's paying for it.
Well, yeah, and that, to be honest, there are a lot of things that we do across government where it's quite right that we get a contribution from those who are involved in that sector. But what's important is, I think, that we have the centre doing that work on making sure that research is
right.
Appropriate.
But just to be clear, I mean, is that because you prefer industry to do it, or you prefer, or would have preferred DEFRA or whoever within the other agencies to do it? Were funds available to do it?
I think, Minister, as I understand it, the EU rules require that the companies come forward with evidence to support the authorisation of products.
But my understanding was that the EU was actually funding research which we chose not to take forward because the UK preferred the industry to do the research instead.
Well, I think there's two different questions. One is about funding, and one is who's doing the research. Who is overseeing? Are the industry effectively designing their own project, funding it, and saying there you go, or is it actually? I mean, whether if they fund something that is then overseen separately. I guess an analogy would be pharmaceutical companies that would invest money in making a case for a product, but then it'll be it's sort of it's a self-spell. It's probably a bad and inappropriate analogy, but I'm just saying that the scope of the study is being set by a respected body, but yes, it's being funded by the industry. Okay. What I was also setting out there is the opportunity for us to engage at the European level in making sure that whatever decision is taken, it's evidence-based. I think that's what we would all support.
Okay, and just finally on the national pollinator strategy, I think there were many who welcomed the fact that it had wide public engagement, NGO engagements. Has that provided lessons in other areas of policy making for DEFRA?
Well, yes, and we do have also our civil society partnership that we're working with. So you have civil society partnership, which right. We've are doing some good work for us, and citizen science, which I think is also another subject which you're interested in as part of their work programme for us. They'll be looking at ways that we can take that forward, that it actually delivers what we want it to do, sort of evidence that's robust, that's useful, that does engage people and encourage them to be involved in those projects. So hopefully, if that work moves forward the way we want to do, that would be something other departments could learn from as well.
Okay, thank you. Simon Wright.
Thank you. I've got a few questions on the objective of embedding sustainable development across government. What is your latest assessment of the progress of getting SD embedded in departments' policy making and operations? And would you say that there are still areas, there are still actions that still need to happen?
I'm sure there are actions that still need to happen, but the important thing is to make the case and increase the capability of the people who are delivering that on the ground to do that, and that's where we've focused on leading with workshops and information to help the other departments understand what their responsibilities are. And Colin, I think you sort of set out earlier on, but maybe just another little word on.
Yeah, so things like the online training for officials to understand what sustainable development means for them, looking at the impact assessment system, working with Treasury on the reporting system for government departments, working with the Minister for Public Policy, for government policy, looking at the business planning process and making sure that sustainable development is integral to that, so that what emerges is as sustainable a package of proposals as we can.
And are DEFRA and the Cabinet Office still reviewing departments' business plans to ensure that they adequately address sustainability, or are the departments themselves sort of reviewing their own work?
Well, the business plans are reviewed through the Cabinet Office, and as Grant said earlier on, the Minister for Government Policy has taken a close interest in that, and that now the element of sustainable is integrated into those plans, and I've had the opportunity to have discussions with him across a number of areas, and I think if there's a feeling that we're not seeing what we want to see delivered, then I'm sure that's something that will be raised so that we can address that and seek to provide further tools, further training, further information to make that point.
And are you able to point to any changes to departments' policies that have taken place as a result of the reviews of business plans that have taken place so far?
Part of the problem with answering that question is it can quite often be a very iterative process. So they can say, well, this kind of thing, and we might say, well, have you thought about that? And, at what point did a decision go from option A to option B because of sustainable development considerations is almost impossible to pin down if the process actually is working well, because they're thinking about it already, they're asking themselves those kinds of questions. So it's a really hard question to answer, I'm afraid.
But it is in an iterative way, yes, leading to changes to
yes,
the plans. When will the 2013-14 Greening Government Commitment Annual Report be published, and are you expecting all targets to be met by all departments?
Thursday will be.
Okay, great.
So I think in civil service, that would be imminently, I think is the phrase that's used. Thursday. So I think it's been a really positive process, and really when I came into it, obviously having been appointed to government later on in the coalition government, but I pay tribute to the work that Oliver Letwin and Norman Baker did to drive this process forward. I know they spent a lot of time talking to permanent secretaries and really drilling down into how these things were or were not being driven with the pace that they wanted to see across all departments. There are some departments that have found this a lot more challenging than others. So in terms of the targets across government, then we've made a great deal of progress, and you'll see on Thursday that instead of those we've exceeded them. For example, paper consumption, there was a 10% target, and it'll be a 31% reduction, which has been so some of those others. Domestic flights, we've had 2 good years where we're within the target, and unfortunately now we may have slipped a little bit. So again, it's not a piece of work that you finish. You've got to continue to do that. And with that in mind, we've set out where we want to see that work going now to hand over to whichever to the administration that comes next. And then it'll be a matter for them to see whether they think they want to carry on that process in the way that we've done it, or whether they want to change how these sorts of assessments are taken forward.
Okay, could I just ask one final question then about the well-being metrics that the ONS have been developing? And I wondered if the business plan review process is now taking account of those well-being issues.
That's a question not on the slide.
Cabinet Office leads on wellbeing issues, and so hopefully they are having that internal conversation, but because they lead on both aspects. So
it's not something you're directly involved. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're just very conscious of everybody's time. Can I just ask a question relating to our fracking report? Where, as you're aware, we had a recommendation for a moratorium on fracking, and subsequently in the debate that followed and the amendments which came back from the House of Lords following on from the government's acceptance of the opposition's amendment to introduce safeguards, there is some concern now in some quarters that the changes that were made to, I think it's section 50 of the legislation that's come back, which actually introduced for the first time a formal definition, a statutory definition of what constitutes fracking, which, as I understand it, amounts to a certain level of cubic metres of fracking fluids, which will determine whether or not something is or isn't fracking. Could I just have your response really on that amendment that has been introduced by the government and what the implications of that are, and whether or not that will leave certain operations, exploratory operations or full operations, and the cumulative effects of those operations over time, what the effect, if any, that changed definition will have?
I understand, the views of the committee. The position of the government has always been that
I really do need you to speak up because I'm just having
the position of the government has always been that there are safeguards in place. So I think the important thing for Parliament here was to see some of those set out, and so the government accepted the amendment. From
but my question is, will those safeguards apply where the amount of water consumed or the amount of fracking fluid relating to the water content is less than a certain threshold? So in other words, I think there are fears that some of the safeguards, although not all were introduced, and the government reneged on that, but I think the issue is whether or not those safeguards which do apply would actually relate, for example, to the current operations underway, for example, in or proposed for Lancashire. Would they be under the threshold, under this new legal definition that the government has now introduced for fracking?
With regard to the specific things in Lancashire, I haven't got that information in front of me, so I'd have to get back to you as to which particular applications will be covered by this. But in terms of the principle, obviously, the environmental permitting regime and the Working Environment Agency, they oversee all aspects of this process, whether it's at the exploratory stage or at the stage of exploiting any resource. So,
yes, it would be very helpful if you could clarify which operations would be safe, where the environmental safeguards would be.
I will obviously have to liaise with my colleagues in DEC and ensure that we get information, because it's led by DEC. But
but DEFRA is responsible surely for the framework for the environmental safeguards, particularly relating to water.
Certainly there are aspects of the regulation of it which are down to us. I know one of the issues that they were keen to clarify when you were talking about setting out the definition of fracking was that, for example, with the possibility for exploiting geothermal energy, that
I'm not talking about geothermal, I'm talking about fracking.
Sure, absolutely. But some of the issues that were being set out, I think, under the original opposition amendment could have involved geothermal as well. So it's important to set out the definitions around fracking so that...
but my specific question relates to shale gas fracturing or whatever the official
as I've said,
definition
I'd be happy to get back on
okay.
that.
Alan?
I wonder when you're doing that, whether it would be possible to be clear about what the definition of fracking fluid actually is in the new legislation. That is it a fluid which contains water, the chemicals, sand, the whole lot, or is it the fluid that is added to the water, not the whole lot? And if it is the former, then that clearly, it seems to me, can be monitored in terms of the total that has gone into the well, as the legislation suggests. And I would suggest it would be either the Environment Agency or the Department itself that would be.
One thing we've been clear is that any chemicals that are used in fracking would be, the information as to what's being used will be public. So that's no. Yeah. But on that point, I'll get back to you about how the different fluids are treated depending on what's involved.
And finally, if you wanted to raise any issues about the NAO, I'll leave it entirely with you.
Well, just very briefly, I appreciate we have run out of time effectively, but...
And possibly members, I think.
Yes, indeed, yes. I think the time and the members are roughly going at the same time.
But I'm here, so that helps.
But those of us who are members of the committee are still here.
The NAO, when it reported recently on sustainability reporting in individual departments, did suggest that departments are not referencing their performance to relevant sustainable development indicators. Is that something that concerns the department, and does the department have a positive role to play in terms of making sure that actually the position on sustainability reporting in the individual departments is consistent, both between departments and also consistent against indicators?
But in terms of how we account for that and how we assess it, I'm happy to comment.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that we don't consider the Sustainable Development Indicators as a set of targets. They are indicators to suggest how things are going. And certainly we encourage departments to be clear about what are their relevant, if that's the right word, indicators. But it's not something that we would expect them to report separately. And as you may already know, the Office for National Statistics is now responsible for putting together and publishing the SDIs. So there is an independent way of putting them out there in the public domain.
Okay, well, I think I do need to bring it to a close. Can I thank you, Minister, and your two officials, Mr Trundle and Mr Church, for coming along. We hope to be in a position to launch our final inquiry, this one, before the end of the Parliament.
Can I intervene very briefly, because I know you have the final word, but just to thank the committee for the work that you have done over the course of this month, because it may be, I don't know, but it may be the last opportunity I have to say that. So, while we may not always agree on all the recommendations committees come to, it's an important job the committee does, so thank you for that.
Well, that's very kind and generous, thank you. And I very much hope that you'll be able to join us on the occasion of the launch of our progress report in Speaker's House later before the end of the session. So, yeah, no. Thank you very much indeed. Order, order.